waste no time. We're going to go ahead and get started. Excuse me. Thank you all for coming and for joining our meeting today, our public meeting about the Continuum of Care funding opportunity here in Delaware. Housing Alliance Delaware is a statewide nonprofit organization, and we do the work of putting together the Delaware Continuum of Care collaborative application for HUD funding each year on behalf of the Delaware CoC. As the collaborative applicant. So our role is to facilitate this process locally, to do all of the things that we need to do locally here in our state, both at this time when the notice of funding opportunity is out, but also throughout the year to ensure that here in Delaware we can continue to receive and be competitive for federal Continuum of Care funds. These are funds that are used to serve people and families experiencing homelessness throughout our state. In all 3 counties. Many of you I see here, I recognize your name or face. Many of you I do not, so welcome. Hopefully our presentation today will be very informative and help you understand the funding opportunity that is in front of us today and this NOFO season. So as I said, my name is Rachel Stucker. I'm the executive director here at Housing Alliance. I will be one of the presenters today, as will Erin Gallagher, our Continuum of Care program manager. And we're joined by Christy Rubenstein from Diana T. Myers and Associates, who will also be presenting. She and her team over at DMA work with us at the CoC to support our ability to do this work, to receive these funds, and they help us a lot with the funding process. So thank you, Christy, for being with us. Christy is going to talk with us about the notice of funding opportunity, kind of big picture, what that looks like, what HUD is looking for this year in their funding application from communities, including ours here in Delaware. I'm going to be providing information and presenting on the opportunity for our community to apply for new funding and the 2 new funding opportunities and requests for proposal that are currently out. And then Erin's going to be presenting the information that our renewal applicants, so those are organizations that already are receiving Continuum of Care funding, need to know going forward through this process. So thank you all for being here. Housekeeping wise, please keep yourself muted unless we open it up for question and answer. There will be opportunities throughout for question and answer. You can also feel free and should feel free to put your questions in the chat. We will monitor that and make sure that we provide answers to those questions as well. Throughout, you will see the slides that we present today. You will see our contact information there. You can always reach out to us if you have any lingering questions that come up after our time together today. Excuse me. And much of what we will also say throughout our presentations is this information can be found on our website. So even before we get started, we've tried our best and put a lot of effort into making sure the Continuum of Care page on Housing Alliance Delaware's website, there's a Continuum of Care funding page, has as much information and all of the materials that you need to know how to apply for and access this funding opportunity. So with that said, one last thing I will say is there are a lot of people here today, which is really exciting. We're always looking for organizations that are interested in doing this work and joining the pool of organizations in our state that receive CoC funding. Because there are so many folks, you might find it a little bit challenging to see the presenter. There is a function in Zoom where you can pin, if you use your mouse and scroll over, you can pin the person who's talking so that they're bigger on your screen, and you can make sure that you can see the person who is talking to you. So please feel free to use that function. With that, I am going to hand it over to Christy to start us off with our big picture overview of the notice of funding opportunity.
Thanks. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. Okay, it should be working. Hopefully folks are able to see. Okay, I'm getting a couple nods here, so. All right, so I'm sorry, I'm just setting up my screen so I can kind of see folks, but also PowerPoint. welcome to this presentation, which is really an overview of the CoC NOFO competition NOFO for 2021. Again, I'm Christy Rubenstein. I'm with Diana T. Myers and Associates, and we've been doing a bit of work with HAD over and the CoC in general over the last couple of years around this kind of work, the competition work in particular. So let's jump in. It's been a while since we had a competition. There was no NOFA or NOFO, or whatever you want to call it, released last year. So a lot of the comparisons that we're going to make are really reaching back to the 2019 NOFA. And the term now is NOFO, and that really comes from it being a notice of funding opportunity, which is the new sort of lingo, versus a notice of funding availability, which was the term used prior. So we'll talk through some of the highlights of this year's NOFO. We'll talk about some key changes from 2019, looking at also the scoring highlights for the application, talk through funding and tiering information a little bit, and then resources and Q&A. All right, so some highlights when it comes to the policies, policy priorities. And so really what we're going to talk through in terms of these policy priorities, this is about HUD telling CoCs across the country, these are the things we really care about. This has guided sort of the way we have crafted questions, the way we have put together points, structures for this year's NOFO. So that's kind of encapsulated in these policy priorities that they lay out. And it kind of gives you a sense of what HUD is looking for and what their expectations are from CoCs moving forward. All right, so the HUD policy priorities, as you can see, we noted which ones were change or new. And there are several new policy priorities this year and a couple that are changed from previous years. And the first one is ending homelessness for all persons. That really hasn't changed. That incorporates a lot of stuff related to the work that CoCs do to house folks, to identify those who have the deepest need, who have been homeless for the longest time, and to build systems to serve them effectively. Using a housing first approach. Now this one's marked as a change, but really it's a little bit of a throwback because what occurred in 2019 is that a lot of the housing first language that had been in prior NOFAs was sort of switched over to this language around low barrier. And there was a new administration, and also Congress enacted some language that said you have to bring back housing first. And so we see a return to housing first. And so just noting that under that 2019 NOFA, HUD had pulled back a bit and allowed things like service participation requirements. We're back under housing first to that not being a thing that would be allowed and considered under housing first. And the CoCs are expected to embrace housing first approaches. Number 3 is reducing unsheltered homelessness. This one's new, and it's kind of interesting that it's included, but probably really a reaction to the rise in unsheltered homelessness being seen in communities across the country, particularly places like California, Florida, places like that. It's a weird one to add in this year because while they added it as a policy priority, they also noted that it's been a challenging year due to COVID, and that the way that a lot of CoCs are kind of at least numerically tracking unsheltered is through the PIC count, and that many CoCs did not do an unsheltered count in 2021 due to COVID. So our data and our understanding of what unsheltered homelessness looks like is probably not where we want it to be. And 2021's PIT data in general is very different both for sheltered and unsheltered than it has been in previous years for many CoCs. So while this is a policy priority, there's not a lot of points allocated to the data around PIC data and unsheltered homelessness. The next one is improving system performance. Again, this remains a key HUD goal for CoCs to always be looking at how they're working to improve their system writ large. How are you working to provide better services to clients, to build a system where you can provide everyone who needs it access to the housing and services that they need, and to bring in more housing units into your CoC sort of housing stock. The change for this year really in terms of system performance is again due to COVID. HUD's expectation around the data has changed. In previous years, HUD was very much looking at our system performance measures, data outcomes, and expecting CoCs to make significant progress from year to year. HUD has said, hey, this year we get it. You all were asked to focus heavily on COVID and responding to COVID. Your data probably looks a little strange in 2020 into 2021. So we're not going to really look at that in the same way. Hence, there's been a scaling back of the points attached to system performance. And we'll see that when we talk about scoring. All that said, HUD still expects CoCs to be engaged in working to improve your systems, working on continuous quality improvement, working to keep an eye on that data at least, and try to make improvements over time. Number 5, 6, and 7, we have specific slides on, so I'll talk through those a little bit more. 5 is partnering with housing, health, and service agencies. That's a new one. It's something we've always been expected to do, but it's kind of got a little twist to it this year. Racial equity, we'll talk a little bit about that one, and then persons with lived experience. So in terms of partnering with housing, health, and service agencies, really what HUD is saying is that we want you to be working to bring these resources to the table and to maximize those mainstream and other resources. And so they say like, hey, we have to work closely with healthcare organizations, healthcare in this way being sort of a broad umbrella, right? That would include physical, mental, and behavioral health resources. Partner closely with PHAs and other housing organizations. So not just PHAs, but also be thinking about other housing organizations in your community, folks that are tapping into other subsidized housing and housing resources. Partner with local workforce development centers and work with tribal organizations to ensure that tribal members can access CoC funded assistance where applicable. On racial equity, there have been some changes. They've provided a definition of racial disparities in the NOFO. I'll just read through it. Promote equity throughout the CoCs, a homeless response system for Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, non-white, and LGBTQ who are disproportionately more likely to experience homelessness than their white, straight, and gender-conforming counterparts. Efforts to prevent and end homelessness must appropriately address any racial inequities to achieve positive outcomes for all persons experiencing homelessness, such as receiving necessary services and housing to exit homelessness. So that's sort of their definition, working definition on racial disparities. What we see in sort of this racial equity sort of focus as a policy priority is they've really shifting from the prior NOFAs of looking solely like, did you do a racial disparities analysis and kind of tell us a little bit about what you're doing? And we're really shifting from like, we expect you to do that analysis and then really tell us the action steps that you're taking to address that. So there are points related to having done the analysis, looking at whether people of different races or ethnicities are less likely to receive homeless assistance or positive outcomes, whether racial or ethnic disparities are present in your system, and then whether CoCs and homeless providers identified barriers that led to those disparities and have taken steps to eliminate these barriers to improve racial equity. So those steps can look like any number of things, but this is them saying, here's our expectation by saying this is a policy priority. Also in there in the mix is that points were added to determine if CoCs are promoting racial equity related to the local CoC competition. So that's our sort of scoring and selection process. So including around rating factors, review selection and rank process, and rating and ranking projects based on the degree to which program participants mirror homeless population demographics. So these are all things that are now expected to be a part of the local CoC competition. In terms of persons with lived experience, HUD has been promoting this for quite a while, really over the last couple of years, so this comes as no surprise. They're really driving home and trying to provide, I think, TA and resources to CoCs to say that we want you to engage folks with lived experience as part of your planning and decision-making process, right, in terms of your apparatus. That would include engaging those folks in conversations around addressing homelessness, determining how local priorities may need to be revised and updated, participating in CoC meetings and on committees as stakeholders, providing input for decisions, and providing input related to the local competition process as well. So again, full scale, like we want you to be engaging with folks with lived experience. Some prefer the term with lived expertise, right? Bringing them into your process. And it's just interesting to note, because this is a requirement for CoC funded agencies, right? To have someone with lived experience as part of your board, or also maybe it's not your board, but whatever your policy or decision-making sort of group is, the expectation is someone with lived experience is a part of this, and they really want to see that this person has a somewhat recent experience of homelessness, not was maybe homeless 20 years ago, but within like 7 years, and sort of can bring that more recent experience to the table, or are currently program participants. So the other thing that really applies just to the CoC is that full points are available if there's more than one person engaged in the local CoC planning process that has lived experience, and at least one person with lived experience came from an unsheltered location. All right. Does anybody have any questions on those? If so, feel free to throw them into the chat. We'll get to them, but we'll talk through some of the key changes from 2019. Again, no NOFA in 2020, no NOFO in 2020. So we're going back in time to 2019 before COVID was even a glimmer in our eye, and comparing really the changes from that NOFA to the current NOFO. So key change, well, the due date, which is important for those of us who need to pay attention to that to make sure everything gets in on time. There have also been, as we discussed, this shift in points to reflect an emphasis on racial equity, housing and healthcare coordination efforts, and COVID-19 response. So we'll talk about this a little bit. There are actually 20 points now in the CoC application just for how the CoC responded to COVID. Several questions and attachments were removed, a few were added, and many questions shifted in point value. Questions may have also shifted in terms of sort of like how they were categorized and the framing of the question. So what we've seen is just some shifts in various places in this application. And then we noted here a shift from low barrier language to housing first language. I talked about that earlier, but that is important to note that we're back to that housing first language. A big one for those of you who are renewal applicants, or perhaps considering a new project application. It used to be that if you had a question when you were doing your applications, you would submit those to the AAQ, the HUD AAQ. That is not the process anymore. They basically are saying, don't submit your questions to the AAQ. We have these two special email addresses. One is for general NOFO questions, one is for eSNAPs. And that is where your questions must go. So I'm calling that out. because it was pretty easy to miss, buried in some of the emails that came out. But this was sort of our response all the time, is like, oh, you have a question, submit it to AAQ. Not anymore. You have to go through these email addresses to get assistance from HUD. Tribal entities are now eligible applicants. I'm not sure if that applies to the CoC or not, but there you go. Up to 10 projects can be consolidated. It used to be limited to 4. And then another change is just additional language around dedicated beds versus dedicated plus. Our recommendation at DMA is that CoCs are somewhat directive with applicants around whether to be dedicated or dedicated plus. So perhaps Rachel and Aaron will have more to say on that. But there's this sort of distinction in these 2 categories for PSH projects. All right, funding and tiering information. So there's a big change this year in terms of this idea of tiering. And so those who are unfamiliar, what HUD asks us to do is to sort our projects into basically a list, a priority list. It's called the priority list. So all projects that get submitted get a number, and they are submitted to HUD in that order. Now, what HUD has said is that, well, we don't really have enough funding all the time to fund everything for everybody. We have maybe enough to guarantee a certain amount for everybody, and then we're going to make you all compete for additional funds, right? So that's where this tier 1 and tier 2 concept comes from. This year, tier 1 is equivalent to the amount that it would take to renew all the eligible projects that you already have in operation, right? So all the renewals that you have out there, tier 1 is 100% of that amount. And now it's just an amount. It doesn't mean that you can only put renewals in tier 1. So tier 1 can be a mix of new projects and renewal projects. So I just want to be clear on that. But the amount that's safe for every CoC in the country this year is more. It used to be like 95%, things like that. Depends on how much funding they got in a given year. So we're all feeling very lucky that it's at 100% of the ARD, which is the annual renewal demand. Again, that's the amount it would take to fund all the renewals. And that's great. So tier 2, the amount for projects that are going to compete nationally with all the other projects in tier 2 across all the other CoCs in the country, that amount for all CoCs is essentially equivalent to the CoC bonus. And the CoC bonus this year is 5% of ARD. And we'll have another slide where I'll show you the actual numbers and how this works out. But again, everything that's in tier 2 is going to be, you're competing against projects across the country to be still selected to go on to be funded. In addition to that funding, HUD has $102 million available nationally for DV bonus projects. Those are projects that are specifically serving survivors of domestic violence. And that amount is capped for each CoC at a certain level that you can apply for. It is 15% of what is known as the preliminary pro rata need. And we will get to show you how much that is, but it's about $700,000 for your community. So tier 2, again, will be competitively funded based on this like sort of a little mini competition. It's 100 points available to each project that's in tier 2, and that's 50 points are based on the CoC's application score. So if you're in tier 2, you want your CoC to have an amazing score so that you can maximize points there. 40 points for the project's ranking. So this is really dependent on how much in funding sits above your project in tier 2. The more funding that sits above it, the less points you can get of that 40 points. And then a commitment to housing first. So if you commit to doing housing first, you would get 10 points automatically. Again, tier 2 projects can be a mix. It can be renewal projects, it can be new projects. It can be projects funded through the DV bonus. don't necessarily recommend that all the time. So that's a strategy issue for the scoring committee to consider. But essentially, those new projects can also be funded through reallocation or through the CoC bonus, or a combination of the two. So what does all this mean? The CoC in general can apply for close to $9.5 million, which is pretty nice. Most CoCs won't get all that they apply for. This is a combination of all your renewals, plus if you got all your CoC bonus and the DV bonus and the CoC planning grant. So all of that goes in if you have enough, say, new projects to submit everything under your CoC bonus and your DV bonus, all that stuff. How it breaks out, Tier 1, we can see here, you are not a YHDP community. If you were, your ARD would be larger than Tier 1, but you're not, so it's equivalent. The CoC bonus is about about $400,000 this year, about a little over $700,000 for the DV bonus, as I mentioned earlier. So that's larger than your CoC bonus, and something to think about. Would be great to bring more DV resources to CoCs. I'll just give a plug for this because there's a tremendous overlap, especially in families with children, between households that experience domestic violence and households that are homeless. And then we have our CoC planning dollars here, which is set at 3% of your final pro rata need for you guys. That is your ARD. So that's the full funding package that will go in. Okay, scoring of the 2021 CoC application. This is quite different this year, and a lot of adjustments made due to COVID and sort of the application that the CoC has to submit, which is distinct from the applications that those of you who are doing new projects applications or renewal project applications will submit. So you're going to work on your project applications. Meanwhile, Rachel and Aaron and the team are going to be working on this big application with lots of questions on behalf of the full CoC. And a lot rides on how that application is scored, as we just saw, because the better that you score there, the more likely you are to get projects that are in Tier 2. All right, so not much change in terms of project ranking, review, and capacity. This is everything to do with a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but the new project selection process, the renewal project scoring and selection process, everything about that is what this 30 points is related to. System performance greatly reduced. A lot of this has to do with the fact that system performance was really heavily scored on data outcomes related to your SPMs from year to year. So HUD was always expecting you to make 5% improvements on your SPMs from year to year. This year, they're like, forget it. We'll just back off on that one. A lot of it was also in this category, but in another one related to PIT data and whether you're making progress in reducing homelessness. So between those two, we see a huge reduction in points on the system performance side. The CoC still has to respond to a bunch of questions to say, here's what we're doing to work to improve on system performance and really address the key metrics there, but the data part has really been taken out. Homelessness Management Information System, so HMIS, the points that we see added here really have to do with the DV comparable database, so not really a lot of changes here. We see a reduction in the point value for the PIT count because lots of CoCs didn't really do it the same way. So the points here are really about a commitment to doing a PIT count, including an unsheltered count in 2022. It's interesting given the rise in COVID again, and we will see how that plays out as we move forward. What was zeroed out, performance and strategic planning. This entire section used to be really focused on the 4 key subpopulations identified through the federal Opening Doors Plan. Folks remember that. That's chronic, veterans, families with children, and youth. And so there used to be a series of questions and also a look at your data to see, are you driving down homelessness among these key populations and what are the strategies you're using? That's all gone. This whole section is gone. So a lot of the questions have migrated to other places. So it's not that they entirely disappeared, but they have shifted them around. And a lot of it was data driven around PIT data. And so because of the issues with the PIT, they've really just pulled back on the points in that section. So we also have CoC coordination engagement. We can see 40 points got added here, right? So this is where HUD's saying, we expected you over the last couple of years to do a lot of work on your system engagement coordination efforts. And the points really here are little points throughout, touch on lots of different areas that have to do with how your system operates and how you're connecting with stakeholders, how you're bringing people in, how you're serving folks who might have different barriers. So it really is a wide range of questions in this section and topics that are covered. And also 20 points just for the CoC's response to COVID. There are these 10 bonus points, and this is a totally new thing, but this is really about, are you submitting new project applications that have some component, some degree of leveraging resources, housing and healthcare resources, and bringing those to the CoC. So for a total, it's 163 points this year instead of 200, plus these 10 bonus points, which every CoC will be thinking about, how do I get those? All right, so I'll just talk very briefly. I probably touched on most of this in terms of these bullets. I think the one I didn't really get into was just areas of increased points. It also includes racial equity. I talked about the COVID and then the housing and healthcare. Everything else I touched on already. In terms of significant scoring updates, we do see this emphasis, little things here and there. So these are all like things where we've seen it rise by 2 or 3 points maybe. Discharge planning is one of them. And this is really interesting because this change here is really thinking about helping to identify affordable and integrated housing opportunities for individuals with disabilities transitioning from institutional settings. So that's thinking about that. Discharge planning is a struggle for most CoCs. Some institutions are incredibly difficult to coordinate with and work with, but HUD is not backing off of this and has an expectation that CoCs are still going to be working on this. And here's a specific sort of thing they want you to work on, which is around engaging and providing resources for folks with disabilities transitioning from institutional settings. CoC coordination and engagement. Again, we see mainstream benefits, always been something that HUD has asked about. It was kind of like downplayed maybe in previous ones. We're back, I think, to this connection to mainstream benefits. And it's 4 points instead of 1 point. So always pushing and encouraging providers and the CoC in general to be making those connections so that clients have access to mainstream benefits. PHA, that is now worth 10 points. That's really coordination with your PHAs. Again, HUD's expectations here, I think, are increasing for CoCs because there are these opportunities and resources out there like mainstream, like FUP, like FYI, like EHVs. And so HUD's expectation is that CoCs are engaging with PHAs and creating these opportunities to bring those resources to their clients. CoC coordination engagement things that got added include ensuring families are not separated, CoC collaboration related to children and youth. This isn't really new in the sense that it actually moved from that one section that got zeroed out into this section. And this has always been a priority for HUD to understand how CoCs are working with early child care providers, with their education systems, and informing clients of their rights in terms of education for children. Addressing the needs of LGBTQ, that's now 5 points, persons with lived experience. And I said, again, addressing COVID, a whopping 20 points, which is a lot. And so I think you guys, I've heard, have done good things. So hopefully we'll be able to maximize those points. Other updates on the project capacity review and ranking side, some tweaks here and some benchmarks really established by HUD. So it used to be objective criteria was like 18 points, but now it's sort of like broken up into these different pieces. And there's this criteria related to system performance worth 8 points and objective worth 8 points. And And they are setting thresholds. They want to see like 33% of the points of objective criteria have to be objective criteria, right? They really are pushing CoCs to get beyond, say, like subjective criteria and move to really having these objective criteria to evaluate renewal and wherever you can, your new project applicants. And then the system performance, I think that has to be 20% of your overall points available in your scheme. Added is the use of a comparable database. So again, they're pushing this for DV providers to make sure that there is the use of a comparable database, and then promoting racial equity. On HMIS, again, use of a comparable database, we see it again. Point in time count, again, this really shifted to be, are you committed to doing a sheltered and unsheltered count in 2022 and a youth specific count for 2022. And then system performance, again, we noted the big reductions here. There's still an emphasis on these, and the CoC will have to talk about all the amazing things you're doing to, say, reduce the length of time homeless or to increase exit to permanent destinations. But it is worth far fewer points because the gap there is that it was just like the data analysis and whether you had shown that you were making progress through data in the prior NOFA. Leveraging housing resources, we talked about this, but again, if you can submit a new permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing project that utilizes housing subsidies or subsidized housing units not funded through the CoC or ESG, you would be eligible to get the 5 points. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic here. The CoC is eligible for those points, relying on applicants to go find those sort of partnerships and bring them to the table in terms of new project applications. And the same thing with the healthcare resources. And this can be direct contributions from a public or private health insurance provider or provision of healthcare services by a private or public organization tailored to the program participants of the project. So resources, for those of you who are going to be doing this work, our recommendation is always just to check on that HUD Exchange eSnaps application page. eSnaps page on HUD Exchange has lots of material. They kind of redesigned it to try to make it easier for folks to find what they need. Highly recommend, if you're doing an application, you go find the detailed instructions and navigational guides and use those. They are extremely helpful. Questions, again, have to be submitted not through the AAQ, but to these email addresses. I'll say it, probably Erin will say it, probably Rachel will say it. It's so important to not try to submit it to the wrong place if you want a response. Now, I will say that I've submitted a question and gotten a response. Colleagues of mine have submitted different questions with no response as of yet. I do suggest that anybody who submits questions keep track of what you've submitted, put it in a file folder somewhere, put it in a special folder in your email inbox, something so that you remember what you submitted, when you submitted it. And if you don't hear a response, you can come back to the CoC and say, like, I don't know what to do because I submitted this and I got no response yet, and we'll help you out. And with that, my portion is done. I'm trying to be upbeat about it. I've got Snoopy dancing. So happy NOFA. I will stick around for the rest of the webinar in case folks have questions, but I don't know if anything came up while I was talking that folks wanted clarification on or had something I didn't cover. I'm happy to take the question.
Thank you, Christy. Does anyone have a question? Again, feel free to put it in the chat as well. I'm going to go ahead and get started on talking about the new funding that's available and how that process will work at the local level. Please put any questions that you have in the chat and we'll make sure someone's available to answer them. Let me get myself set up here to share my screen properly. All right, Christy, I can still see your face. Can you nod if you can see my screen? Perfect. Thank you. All right, so we are going to talk about the new funding that is available and the local RFPs that are currently out. All applications. So the RFPs were released on Friday, August 27th, so 2 weeks ago, and are due to Housing Alliance Delaware at 4 o'clock by 4 p.m. on September 24th. If we had a choice, we would provide you with much more time to complete these project applications. We have some very strict deadlines that we are required to meet as a continuum of care in order to be able to apply for this HUD funding. In order to apply for new funding, you must be an eligible applicant. So you have to be a 501c3 nonprofit agency, state or local government, or instrumentality of state or local government, Indian tribe, or tribally designated housing entity. You also have to have a SAM registration or DUNS number. And one thing I'll say about the new funding and folks considering coming in for new projects, funding, even if you are selected locally to be included in our application to HUD, funding is not guaranteed. Some of the things that Christy talked about project ranking and the tiering process and all of that that goes into the application process impacts which projects ultimately end up getting funded. So you are submitting a project application for this funding to the local continuum of care through Housing Alliance Delaware. A local decision is made about whether or not that application will be, whether your project application will be included in our community's application to HUD, and then final funding decisions will likely be announced in early 2022 by HUD. And again, all materials will do at 4 p.m. September 24th, 2021 to Housing Alliance Delaware per the instructions on the applications and the RFPs. As I said in the beginning, I'll say again, all the materials that you should need to apply are on our website, on our CoC funding page. The link is there for you to follow. And I just have a screenshot there on the right. So there are 2 RFPs for new funding that are out. One RFP is specifically for permanent supportive housing, totaling a little over $5 million. These are funds that are currently being used to provide permanent supportive housing to people and families who are formerly experiencing chronic homelessness, according to the HUD definition. The way that this RFP has been structured has some budget restrictions by geography based on how the projects currently operate. So folks who are interested in coming in for that funding, who do not currently administer that funding, must come in for funds according to those geographic restrictions. So for example, someone interested in implementing a permanent supportive housing project that serves homeless households, chronically homeless households in Sussex County only is limited to come into that $180,867 amount. The new bonus projects are, the amounts there are, as Christy said, for the CoC bonus and DV bonus, a little over 400,000 is available for the CoC bonus and a little over 700 for the DV bonus. So we'll talk about the permanent supportive housing RFP first. Again, these funds are specifically for permanent supportive housing. Currently are being used to provide scattered site permanent supportive housing using a master leasing model. And so if you review the RFP, you'll see an appendix on the last page that outlines the current funding and grant structures. You are not, if you are a new entity who is interested in competing for those funds, you are not obligated to structure your grant proposal in those specific ways, but that is there for your reference so that you can understand how the funds are currently being used, because project applications will be prioritized. So when the funding committee is reviewing these applications, projects that are able to describe a plan by which they would be able to continue providing services to people currently housed in those units, that prioritizes the housing stability of those current residents, either continuing to help them stay in their unit or helping them move on to other permanent housing opportunities, are going to be prioritized for that funding, to have that application considered. Additionally, projects that have applicants that have experience operating housing first projects that achieve good housing outcomes for residents are prioritized for that funding, as well as projects that would use a scattered site housing model, which is the way that funding is currently being used in the community. I will make a note that I see some activity in the chat, but I am not able to monitor the chat while I'm presenting. So if folks, I will allow Erin or Felicia or Christy to interrupt me if any of it has to do with me. The new bonus project RFP, the CoC bonus, the 400 and some thousand. So applicants can come in for permanent supportive housing projects serving chronically homeless individuals or families. Folks can come in to administer rapid rehousing projects serving individuals or families or youth. Folks can come in for joint transitional or rapid rehousing projects, or permanent housing projects that serve people, survivors of domestic violence, people fleeing, attempting to flee domestic violence, which includes human trafficking, sex trafficking, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence. The DV bonus funds are specifically limited to that population, and project types under the DV bonus are limited to rapid rehousing and joint transitional rapid rehousing projects.
Rachel, there was a question in the chat. What is the benefit of applying for DV bonus over applying for regular CoC bonus fund?
Sure. So DV bonus funds are additional funds that the CoC would like to be able to bring to our community. And so projects that come in as a DV bonus project that are serving that population are more competitive because they are because there's the potential that they will bring additional dollars to the community. I will also say that if someone were to submit a DV specific application under the, so they're both in the same RFP for bonus funds, generally, the continuum of care might say, this looks like a great project, we're going to submit it to HUD as a DV bonus project, right? So there is a benefit to the continuum of care of seeking to bring those additional dollars to the CoC. I hope that answers the question. Christy, yes, I'm like, Christy, you unmuted yourself. Please feel free.
I also threw in some comments in the chat, just to note that the DV bonus has a little mini competition of its own, essentially. And it depends on the project type that you're applying for, but I think we're not talking about SSOCE here, probably. So much depends. 50 points would be dependent on the CoC's application score, sort of like that tier 2 formula. 25 points dependent on the ability of the CoC to demonstrate the need for the project. So that is to basically crunch numbers and say, we have this unmet need in our community among DV survivors. And then the remaining 25 points is the quality of your specific application when it comes to rapid and TH/RH projects. And then I think there was another question about, like, do you have to commit for DV bonus? You're very much, you will only be able to serve those fleeing DV under that bonus, and that would carry forward into the future. However, I will note that you can have a project that is not serving specifically DV that can be expanded upon, but those units, if they're funded through the DV bonus, can only from that point forward serve DV, those survivors. So There are different ways to do this. It's an exciting opportunity. It's a lot of money available. Unclear how competitive it will or won't be, but I can say that I've worked with CoCs that have gotten the DV bonus and those that don't. And I think a lot depends on your ability to demonstrate need.
Thank you, Christy. There was also a question from Felicia. We will definitely be, this entire presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our website, and all of the slides will be posted on that same CoC funding page as well, so that folks can review this information at any time. So all new projects that apply, whether you are applying under the permanent supportive housing RFP or the bonus RFP, and if in that RFP you are or are not coming in for DV bonus specific dollars, are being evaluated on the same criteria at the local level. The weighting of that criteria looks a little bit different, whether you're coming in on the PS permanent supportive housing RFP or the bonus dollar RFP, but the criteria is generally the same. So when you are completing your application, and I'll go through all the application materials that need to be submitted, but when you're completing your application, these are the things that the funding committee is looking at when they're making decisions about which projects to fund. So there is a section that will address the applicant's experience and capacity. Does the applicant have experience administering this type of project? Rapid rehousing. Has this applicant administered rapid rehousing before? Permanent supportive housing. Has the applicant administered permanent supportive housing before? Has the applicant served this household type or target population previously? And what was that experience? And what is the applicant's experience and capacity when it comes to administering grants, financial accounting systems, and those kinds of things that it takes to administer a federal HUD grant. So that is taken into account. That is not meant to say that folks without experience administering these specific project types or serving these specific target populations that they are seeking to serve should not apply. It is one element that is being considered. We are always interested in talking to folks who are interested in starting to do this work. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that. For folks who are currently, so all of my renewal folks out there, nice to see you. If you are interested in coming in for new funds, there is a section that is only relevant to you that will take into account your past performance as a CoC grantee, receiving these funds and administering these projects. There is a section of the application that looks at the scope and need. So that's really where you're explaining your plans to administer the project. That is being taken into account. What is that project description? Does it seem reasonable? Is it clear that you have a clear plan for how the project would be administered? And what is the need for the project you are proposing? The details of the budget. Does your budget meet requirements? All of those are outlined in the RFP and application. All continuum of care funded projects are required to have 25% of the total in matching funds, unless it's a leasing project. That is explained in some more detail in the application as well. So do you meet that requirement? 10% or less must be in the administrative line. But beyond those budget requirements, the committee is going to be looking at, is this a reasonable budget for this project type, right? What does this look like? Does this provide enough funding for there to be sufficient services provided to participants? Housing First and Low Barrier, experience implementing this Housing First projects with low barrier access, and a clear understanding of the Housing First model as an evidence-based practice. Or that the applicant is demonstrating that they understand what that is and they are dedicated to implementing their project in that way. There will be a section on housing case management that looks at case manager-client ratio, looks at the applicant's explanation of how services will be provided, that services are sufficient, that they're provided in alignment with the Housing First model. And so there is a whole section looking at and helping to, the committee will be looking to ensure that there is sufficient housing focused case management services provided to participants in the project. For projects that are operating under a scattered site model, so working with private landlords in the community to house folks, what are those landlord relationships like? Does the applicant have experience partnering with landlords, working with landlords to house folks in the community, or have existing landlord relationships in Delaware? And then there's a section on resource linkages. What are the applicant's plans to help households connect to community-based supports, mainstream services, as well as other natural supports in the community that may be able to support community inclusion for participants. In alignment with the CoC NOFO, as Christy talked about, we are offering bonus points to project applicants who can evidence that they have will be utilizing housing subsidies or subsidized housing units that are not funded through the CoC or ESG programs as part of the implementation of their project. So this could be home funding that's been made available through the American Rescue Plan. So there's home funding that's been made available to the HUD jurisdictions in Delaware to do things like hotel motel purchasing and acquisitions to create permanent supportive housing. So if you know your local HUD jurisdiction, you can reach out to them and say, hey, I have a great idea for a permanent supportive housing project. Maybe you're already speaking with them. Maybe there are already plans in place to use those dollars, and CoC funding could be partnered and paired with those funds to create a new permanent supportive housing project. One example. Maybe you have a partnership with your local public housing authority with their 811 units, for example, mainstream 811 vouchers. Maybe you have a relationship with someone at DSHA who administers the 811 vouchers for the state, and you want to reach out and say, hey, is there a way that we could pair those 811 vouchers with permanent supportive housing dollars to create more permanent supportive housing for formerly chronically homeless people in Delaware? Please do that. Please contact us if you're interested in doing that. Please consider doing that. We're happy to talk with you through how that might work. It doesn't have to be Public Housing Authority dollars. So the examples are there. This language is directly from HUD in terms of what would count as a housing subsidy or subsidized housing unit. And in order to qualify for that bonus, at least 25% of the units in the housing project must be subsidized with that other resource. We are also offering 5 bonus points for projects that utilize healthcare resources. Those healthcare resources can include things like direct contributions from a public or private health insurance provider. You might get funding or plan to get funding from Highmark, for example. I know they support funding here in our state quite a bit, Highmark, Delaware. Are those dollars going to directly support the project that you are proposing? Or that there would be the provision of healthcare services by a private or public organization tailored to the program participants in the project. These things, bringing these resources to the table in your project application, both make your project application more competitive and also make our continuum of care more competitive. If you have any questions about this at all, please feel free to reach out to us. Documentation of commitments must be provided to receive the bonus points and must be provided in order for our continuum of care to receive those bonus points as well. So that must be included in your application. Again, please reach out if you have any questions about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 other types of grants that are new dollars, but are only relevant to renewal applicants. So one of those is expansion grants. So these are for the folks, again, these are renewal applicants only, people who are already receiving CoC funds to do this work in Delaware. Renewal applicants can apply for expansion grants. Ultimately, what that means is you're applying for new money to expand a current project. So let's say you administer a permanent supportive housing project in Delaware, and you want to be able to serve 20 more households in your permanent supportive housing project. And to do so, you need $100,000 more. You need to submit a new project application to do that. And you would indicate on your application that you're applying for that money to expand the number of units, beds, persons served in your current project. But it is new dollars. It is a new project application, and you would submit it through the new project application process. In order for that to ultimately be selected by the local funding committee for funding, the renewal project must also be selected for funding, of course, because it would be an expansion of that renewal project. And that would be using CoC bonus processes or the PSH RFP funding as well. Any expansion must add units, beds, person serves, or services provided to existing participants. Transition grants. So if you are someone who is currently receiving continuum of care funding to operate a CoC funded homeless assistance project, you can consider coming in for a transition grant. The way we've talked about this in the past in Delaware, so this is really in a lot of ways a voluntary reallocation, right? So you're saying, I currently operate I'm making this up, I currently operate a rapid rehousing project. I want to reallocate to operate a transitional housing rapid rehousing project, a joint THRH project. And so I am going to apply for a transition grant that will help me transition my current project to this new different project type. So a renewal project applicant would then submit a new project application through this process, this local process that would describe how this new project type would operate and their plans for doing so and what the budget would be, et cetera. There's a lot more details about transition grants and what is and isn't allowed through that process, what those budgets can and can't look like, some requirements that HUD has in place. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I know for those of you who implement renewal projects, we already reached out and spoke with you in the months past about if anyone had an interest in reallocating to new project types, voluntarily reallocating. So I'm not going to go into any more detail here. I'm kind of not anticipating that folks will come in here, but if this sounds like something that you might be interested in doing, please reach out to us and we will make sure to provide you with all the more details you need and talk with you about that. The transition grant is specifically a grant to help you move from one project type to the new project type. So how do you submit a new project application? You go to our Continuum of Care funding website. All the materials that you need are there, and you are going to need to submit the application and the application cover sheet. There's a threshold checklist that outlines all of the criteria that must be met in order for the project to be considered for funding. I strongly recommend that if you are coming in new to this process, the first thing you do is look at the threshold checklist. There is a separate budget form. You must use that budget form. It's an Excel document. Again, it's on the site. Under all of the new RFP application materials, you must use that budget form and complete that budget form and submit it with your application. And you must attach all of the required attachments. These required attachments are listed on the threshold checklist, on the RFP. They include your agency's most recent audit, proof of your eligibility as an applicant, evidence of your active SAM registration, a commitment letter committing the required amount of matching dollars, and if applicable, depending on your circumstances as an applicant, a letter of support, information about your past performance if you are a current CoC recipient, and the supporting documentation that would be required for you to get bonus points on your application if you are applying for those bonus points with a project that leverages other housing or healthcare resources. I feel like I'm going to say this over and over again. All new project applications are due by 4 p.m. on September 24th. We plan to notify folks no later than October 29th if your project has been selected to be included in our application to HUD under this NOFO. If you are selected, you are required to complete an application in HUD's online application system, which is called eSnaps. If you are someone who has received CoC funding before, that sounds very familiar to you, although you may have enjoyed that we didn't have to do that last year. If you have never received CoC funding before, well, even if you have, we are here to help you and provide you with the technical assistance that you need to be able to complete that online application. A lot of what we ask for in the project application that is due on September 24th is also what is asked in that online application to HUD. So the work involved is going to be with getting into that online system and submitting the application. You will have already answered a lot of the questions. So our goal here is to make it for new project applicants coming in, that there is an overlap there so that you're not doing such different things that they're not relevant. And you'll notice on the new project application materials that DMA helped us with quite a lot. Thank you, Christy and team, that on a lot of those questions, it will say this is relevant to eSnaps question, blah, 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 whatever. That will mean nothing to you right now, and that's fine. If your project is selected to be funded, it will mean a lot to you, and it will help you fill out that online application piece in that eSnaps online portal. And as I said, I think in the beginning, HUD provides final funding notification of all the applications that we submit to HUD in early 2022 would be our estimate, and is when they have traditionally provided those notifications. That is all I have on new project applications. I did not go into tons of detail because things are going to be relevant to folks. To different folks, please reach out or ask now if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them.
Hi there, are y'all accepting questions by phone? I'm sorry, I don't have access to the chat.
Hi,
Fantastic.
Xavier.
Oh, how did you know?
Well, I see your name on the Zoom, but I also recognize your voice. Nice to hear from you.
Oh, great, fantastic. Oh, okay, I didn't know you could see my name. Okay, I thought I was in stealth mode. All right, well, here's the question. The question is, I noticed a few times, the bonus points for organizations that connect with other resources. And I would imagine those resources might include primary care, psychiatry, behavioral health, what have you. Do you get the bonus points if you already have those assets in-house? So like, for example, if primary care and integrated services are just integral to the model that you already do, or must you coordinate it with an external resource?
Christy, do you know the answer to that?
It's a good question. I will say that I think the specific bonus points this year on the healthcare and housing side have to do with accessing very specifically healthcare related. So some of the stuff that you were mentioning in your examples, I don't think would fall into that bucket. So it is, however, an interesting question and one worth taking back to HUD on behalf of the CoC. And I think getting a clarification, it really is that challenge of the expectation that we're leveraging mainstream resources wherever possible, or resources from other places in the community. But when agencies are really providing a lot of that stuff, it's definitely, a good question there. I think the issue here is whether you also would be leveraging that or looking for funding to support those activities. And so think about that also in terms of like your application. The extent to which you'd be asking for CoC funds, for example, for rental assistance would mean that's not really leveraging something from outside and bringing it in.
And Xavier, please feel free to follow up with us directly to clarify the specifics of your question as you're considering your application so that we can make sure, because we can submit that directly to HUD. And I want to make sure that when we submit it, it's a very clear question and addresses your specific needs.
Yep, fantastic. Thanks to you both. And I'll go back to not so stealth mode.
Thank you. Other questions about the new project RFPs or application process? If folks have not yet started completing them, when you do, I imagine questions will arise. Through that process, you should feel free to reach out.
Rachel, it's Andrew Henderson from Horizon House. I just
Hi,
had a question.
Andrew.
Hi. I just had a question regarding the existing grants and the renewal grants. Actually, I probably have 20, but I'll just hit one right now. You had broken that down by in various categories: Newcastle County, Kent, Sussex, Sussex. Now, within Newcastle County, there are multiple grants. For our application, should we be applying for all, like for instance, all Newcastle County, or a specific grant number within Newcastle County?
It's a very good question. So that is up to you. We obviously would not want an applicant to apply for something that would be unmanageable, that is significant. So the reason that we provided that appendix of how the funds are currently being used was to help people understand what those expectations might look like. So for example, if you, we included like estimated number of people being served at any given time currently housed. Depending on people's funding structures, what other resources they have available to them, what other resources they're leveraging, it may not be feasible for someone, for a new applicant to be able to serve that many folks with just that amount of CoC money. I'm just making this up as an example. So you would want to consider, and because applicants are being prioritized and considered for that funding in large part based on the extent to it, not solely, but in large part based on the extent to which they would be able to and explain how they would be able to continue to serve people currently housed in those units, you would want to take that into account when thinking about, like, if an applicant says, I can come in for that, I could take over that grant easy peasy, that might be something that you would want to apply for. So that's not a clear answer. I think it has to do with your thinking about how your organization would be able, what your organization would be able to do with what amount of dollars feasibly, given the structure of that RFP and the expectations of serving current residents. Is that helpful?
Yes. So the expiration dates on those contracts are they on the GIW?
So the current grants?
Yes, the current grants.
I can't remember if the GIW included expiration.
I can't either.
No, it didn't.
Yeah,
Okay.
it generally includes the 21 GIW is actually for contracts in the next year. So it just sort of says 2022 as the expiration. It just has the year, not the actual operating dates for the different contracts.
Thank you.
But I'll just say, if you're coming in as a new, you're essentially going to get your own contract year to pick up from, right? So you would come in as a new and you would be set up for your contract to start at some point in 2022 and end, 12 months later.
So it wouldn't be dependent on the current grants contract year, Andrew.
Yeah, I was just asking in case we did multiples, then how would we like starting all those up at one time might be a challenge.
Right. I think when you're working with for new projects that come in for new funding, when you're working with HUD, you are able as a new project to a certain extent determine your own start date. Now, of course, for within 2022, it has to, the latest that a grant funded, if a new applicant were to come in and be funded under this NOFO, The latest possible start date for a new grant would be January 1st, 2023, with an expiration date of December 31st, 2023. We like and want and hope that our applicants can start operating in 2022. But that is the latest possible start date. And then, of course, I think to your point, Andrew, if an applicant were coming in and expected to serve folks that were currently in permanent CoC funded permanent supportive housing projects, there may be a need to think about when that grant would need to start to be able to do that. But that start date would be flexible and able to be set by the applicant and wouldn't be set by HUD. Other questions on a new project, RFPs and funding opportunities?
Well, I'll keep going.
Sure.
If our model is going to be rental assistance, we would be looking to provide a match of 25% on the entire grant.
Correct.
Okay.
Projects that have leasing dollars in them, leasing dollars do not count towards the 25%.
Okay.
Yep. But if it was rental assistance dollars, you would need 25% on the whole grant.
Entire amount.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions, Andrew?
I'm sure I'll have a number coming up, and these are the only ones I was able to formulate into a reasonable question at this point.
Sounds good. Thank you for your questions. I'm going to go ahead and let Erin provide some information for our renewal applicants about what they need to be doing under this NOFO season. If folks come up with any additional questions related to new project dollars, RFPs, and applications, please feel free to place them in the chat, or you can also, we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end. Thanks so much. Erin, take it away.
All right, so these slides are going to be particularly for renewal projects and the process going forward for those who already received CoC. First thing we're going to talk about is EastMaps applications. So as Christine and Rachel mentioned before, EastMaps applications were not required in 2020, so everybody got a nice little break. But this year we do have to submit them in the system, unfortunately. So for process, I put this up front. We're going to go into more detail about the actual applications in a couple minutes, but right out the bat, all EastMaps applications for our renewal projects are due to myself and Felicia Lawrence by 4 o'clock October 4th, 2021. So when you go through to complete your EastMaps applications in the system, you're not going to be officially submitting your application. You will just be filling in the information. So once you have completed your application, you will be able to export that to a PDF, and that is what you are going to send to us over at HAD. And there is just some information about how those files should be named and the subject line when submitting them. So you can submit multiple PDFs in one email. So I do suggest doing that, but if you do have to submit in multiple emails, just make sure you're including like email 1 of 2, email 2 of 2, just so we can keep better track of it. And again, do not officially submit your applications in EastMaps because there might be changes and corrections that we have to go over and re-enter the information. So we do not want to officially submit the applications in EastMaps. We're just sending the information over to us. The other thing that will be required by October 4th at 4:00 p.m. is a supplemental questionnaire. So this is required for renewal projects only, and it only needs to be submitted once per agency. There does not need to be a supplemental questionnaire completed for each individual renewal project. So this supplemental questionnaire is really important to help us answer questions in the actual CoC NOFO. It will be about different partnerships that projects may or may not have, formal agreements with, let's say, childcare providers, other state education agencies, just for an example. So please complete those with as much detail as possible, but make sure you're also being succinct to the question, because we will be pulling information out to use in the actual NOFO application. And there is a link to the supplemental questionnaire. There we will be sending it out afterwards, but it is already available on the website. Application review. So once you submit your eSNAPs PDF to Housing Alliance Delaware, we will be reviewing that for completeness and accuracy. If corrections are needed to your applications, your renewal applications, we will reach out to you directly with instructions and additional timelines for completing those corrections before the official eSNAPs applications are due for submission in eSNAPs. So when completing the applications in eSNAPs, first you are going to be required to have an applicant profile. So making sure that you go through and complete and make sure your applicant profile is updated is going to be very important. Specifically for the applicant profile, you can find HUD instructions and the navigational guides, which will specifically detail what you do and do not have to fill out for the applicant profile. And again, the process here is just to make sure that you're making the necessary updates, that the contact information is accurate, and all of that stuff. You will see information here about different forms that you have to fill out as well. The HUD for the 2880 form for the applicant profile. And when you go to complete that, the renewal grant amounts will automatically fill in on that. So once you review the guides and if you and go to start this step, if you have any additional questions, please just let us know. But those navigational guides, the detailed instructions are the most important thing. We're going to keep plugging those through the entire presentation. So for renewal projects, after you get your applicant profile updated, you will have to review and update your renewal applications. So this starts on page 5 of the detailed instructions. And throughout the application, you'll see an asterisk symbol where you may need to provide a response or an update to information particularly. So screens that require annual updates are listed here. And again, you will be able to see much more detailed information about the specific application in the detailed instructions. So if you do not need to update anything on your application and it is good to go after you've reviewed it, there is an option to submit your application without changes. So these are, that would be question 2 in the application, and that's where you can indicate whether you are going to be submitting your project application without changes or if you are going to be updating that information. For renewal project budget line items, there's a couple things to explain here. So you are not allowed to increase your current budget line items for your grant through this application process. That has to be amended, that has to be applied for through an expansion grant. So if you're looking to increase the amount of money that you're bringing into the grant, it can't be done through your renewal application. You do have to submit a new project application for expansion funds to bring more funds into that project. Now you are allowed to shift funds between your budget line items up to 10%. So for example, if you have $10 in your support service line item and $20 in your rental assistance line item, but you decide you need some more in your support services, you are allowed to take up to 10% from your rental assistance line item and move it into your support service line item. So those are changes that are allowed in your renewal application. You are also able to change the number and configuration of units in your rental assistance budget. You are allowed to reduce BLIs if needed, and if the CoC project was reduced through reallocation. So if your renewal project application is submitted with a reduced total budget, either through reallocation or due to error, the project's total budget will be permanently reduced and required to operate at that reduced amount. So it's extremely important to make sure that you're paying attention for the amount of funds that you are applying for. And if you are moving budget line item around or anything like that, once you submit that budget, if it's anything less than what it was before, they will take that and run with it, and that will be the permanent operation funds for that grant. So be very, very careful when you are doing your project budget if you are making any changes. Some additional application considerations. So renewal projects are being offered the opportunity to consolidate grants through this NOFO. So what consolidation means is if you have two permanent supportive housing projects and you want to combine those into one grant to serve both projects, then you are allowed to do that. You are allowed to do that for up to 10 projects, but no more than 10 projects. And then again, the projects must be of the same recipient and the same components. So you can't consolidate a rapid rehousing project with a permanent supportive housing project. It would have to be permanent supportive housing and permanent supportive housing combining to be the same. To apply to do the following in eSNAPs, you must submit separate renewal project applications for each of the grants that are proposed to be consolidated. You do not need to submit a combined application for both projects. HUD will not permit projects with the following characteristics to consolidate. This is really, really, really important. So if you have any outstanding audit or monitoring findings, if the project has any outstanding obligations to HUD that are in arrears, any unresolved construction delays, poor financial management or drawdown issues, a history of low occupancy levels or lack of administering the project, my little box is covering my text, administering the project type or any other capacity issues. So these are really, really, really important considerations when looking at what grants, if any, you're looking to consolidate. So if you are planning to consolidate, please reach out to your HUD rep for approval. They will be able to tell you which of your grants at the HUD level meets these considerations, or if there would be any issues consolidating any of your projects. And then you also will need to notify us here at HUD so that we can take the appropriate steps to make sure you're getting the support you need to consolidate that. And that is something that needs to be taken into account when selecting new projects. So as soon as possible, please let us know if you're considering that and reach out to your HUD rep to make sure that there will be no issues with the grants you've selected to consolidate. Just some things that are not allowed. The HUD will not permit a transitional housing and permanent housing project to consolidate to form a joint transitional rapid rehousing project. So that can't be done through consolidation. That would have to be done through a transition grant, which Rachel spoke about in the new project funds. So again, that would need to be applied for as a new project and can't as well, and can't solely be done through the renewal projects process. And HUD also will not permit a transition grant to be consolidated with any other project. So if you were going to be transitioning one project into another, with the idea of possibly being able to consolidate that grant with the project type you're transitioning to, that can't be done in the same NOFO year for the same contract. Project applications for grants that are proposed to be consolidated will be ranked individually, and if HUD selects those projects to be funded, then they will provide a single award to the surviving grant, which will be the two consolidated grants put together, the two grants that are consolidated into one surviving grant. If one of the grants is proposed to be consolidated is found to be ineligible for consolidation or is not selected, HUD will award the grants that are eligible for renewal and selected as separate grants. So if you are trying to consolidate two projects and one has an issue, or for some reason it's not eligible for consolidation, they will award those separately as separate grants. Additional considerations, so BLIs for consolidated project applications have to exactly match the sum of the BLIs for each individual project. Whatever project, so if you have rental assistance and support services in your project, for both of them, the final budget for your proposed consolidation has to be the sum of those two projects. Overall, when the grants are expiring, the operating start date, expiring grants and operating start date at the end dates for the projects that are consolidated must be provided. So whenever your grant started operating and whenever it expires, those will need to be provided for both grants that are consolidating, because that is what they use to determine which grant will be the surviving grant when they are consolidated. If the project incorrectly requests consolidation of two or more eligible renewal projects, HUD may reduce the consolidated project, in which case the project applicant will permanently lose funding. So that is also a very, very important consideration. So again, please be very careful when considering these options for your grant. Moving on to an additional consideration for this year's eSNAPS applications is chronic homeless dedication. And Christy had mentioned that a little bit earlier in the presentation. So chronic homeless prioritization was an option provided by HUD previously. However, it is no longer an option for PSH projects to simply prioritize chronic homelessness. And we will no longer be scoring that as a local CoC due to it not being available at the HUD level anymore. So all renewal PSH projects are required to dedicate their projects in their fiscal year 21 eSNAPS applications. If you have any questions about whether your project is currently dedicated or not, or what level of dedicated status it is at, please let us know, but you will be required to dedicate your PSH projects to serve chronic homeless individuals through this application. And there's just more detail about that in the renewal project detailed instructions on page 24 of the detailed instructions. So application resources, again, there is the new process through HUD with the two separate emails instead of using the AAQ as traditionally utilized. So please, if you have any questions, make sure that you are sending them to either of these emails, so that way you are actually getting a response, because they will not be providing that through the AAQ. And starting 2 days prior to the application deadline, so November 14th, the emails listed above will not be providing any technical assistance outside of emergency technical support. So keep that in mind if you have any questions about your eSNAPS applications or anything. Again, the detailed instructions and the navigational guides, please use them. 90% of the time, whenever we get any questions, this is what we're going to reference when looking at it. And this is going to be where we tell you to find the information. So please make sure you are utilizing these and referencing these as you're filling out your applications. They are so incredibly important and resourceful, so please make sure you use them. And then also the main eSNAPS page on the HUD Exchange is another good resource for anything regarding the competition this year. So timeline and appeals. For renewal projects, again, 10/4, 4:00 p.m. is when the renewal project eSNAPS applications and supplemental questionnaires are due to Housing Alliance Delaware. Projects will be notified no later than 10/29 of which projects are selected for application to HUD. And 11/16 is when the full consolidated application is due to HUD from the CoC. And additionally, when the project scores are released and the ranking is released, CoC funded projects have 3 business days to submit an appeal. The appeals can be submitted for project scoring errors, reallocation of CoC funding, or improper application or interpretation of the HUD or CoC rules. For more details on the full appeals policy, you can select that link below. It takes you to the Delaware funding policies, which are also on the CoC funding page, and the CoC appeals form, which is how appeals are submitted. So again, this is just important for projects, renewal projects, to keep in mind that when the scores are released, you have 3 business days to submit that appeal. So just to make sure everybody is aware of that timeline when that occurs. And that is it. So if anybody has any questions, please let us know, and we'll do our best to answer them. Not seeing anything in the chat. Okay. Right. If there are no questions, I will shoot it back to Rachel to close us out.
Well, thanks everyone. If there are no questions, I'm assuming it's because we did an excellent job of providing you with all of the information you need, or it's just so much information and we did such a poor job that you don't even know where to begin with your questions. So hopefully it's the first one. Thank you so much for your interest in doing work in our communities to help people and families experiencing homelessness. Thank you, Tyler, for telling us how much we rock. We appreciate it. You all do too. Many of you are already doing this work in some way or another, whether it's with CoC funds or not. So our deepest appreciation is to you for the extremely challenging, extremely rewarding, extremely needed and necessary work for helping our most vulnerable community members. So please feel free to ask us any questions via email, give us a call. You should have our contact information. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, hi, John. I heard your voice. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask Aaron, Rachel, we have our tips sheet, so I will also send that over to you for the applicants who run into issues. There are
And is
some,
that for anyone using eSnaps, or is that for just renewals?
it's really focused on renewals, but some of the stuff is wider range, so talks about the 2880, which is my favorite form, and things like that, with that even a new project applicant would have to get set up as far as their applicant profile. So
80 is for us, right? Or is that at
what
the 28880 is for the,
for everybody,
oh, I thought it was just for the collaborative app. Consolidated app.
everybody has to fill it out.
That's the consolidated application. That doesn't seem-
No, it's
Okay,
this
never
other
mind,
form where you have to declare whether you have other sources of federal
Oh,
and
okay, never mind. I know what you're talking about now. Sorry. I got that confused with the consolidated app. You know what I'm talking
yeah,
about.
that's just you.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought.
The certification of consistency with your
With the
town plan.
Plan.
Yeah, that one's my favorite. Although for applicants themselves, the 2880 is always trips up at least a couple of people. So, just follow up with us. I will shoot that over to you, and
Okay.
I'm gonna
All right.
hop off and go.
We'll definitely get that out to our renewals now.